Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is TowerGate Day 435, Saturday, May the 19th, 2018. Thank you so much for tuning in. Well, let's see here. Thank you so much to everyone who got through the grueling 3 videos I did yesterday. It was, I try not to do that, but there was just so much. I mean, I go as fast as I can, but there was just so much to cover. And in fact, I still have a few more items left before I finish that up, but we will get it done here in just a minute. Keep in mind, that was a 4,000 word article, 4,000 words plus, and I actually left a lot of things on the table because they're kind of like quite obvious. And so I narrowed it down to like 17, 18 items I had, and but I could have went line by line through the entire 4,000 words, sentence by sentence, and destroyed the entire piece, but I just focused on the main things. So anyway, thank you for all you who managed to get through 3 videos yesterday. Today I'm going to try to do it in 1. We'll see how we do. Again, lots of information today coming out. So we're going to finish up here with the last few things from that New York Times story, and then we'll move on. So another thing that I wanted to point out about this New York Times story is that when they're getting toward about 3/4 of the way down the page in their story, and they're getting right into the part where they should have been talking about the fixing of the Clinton email investigation, they kind of blow right over that, and they never even say a single word, not a single word, about the fact that McCabe for sure and likely Comey sat on the Wiener laptop for 5.5 weeks, and all the things that went along with that. They never even mentioned that. They blew right through that, and the New York Times article didn't say anything about that, and that was critical to this part of the story where they're talking about James Comey came out and reopened the Clinton email investigation, but they say nothing about why he did that. Nothing about why he did that, even though it's public knowledge. Everyone knows why he did it. He did it because he had to, because there were FBI agents and police detectives in the Southern District of New York who were threatening to quit and go public. They forced Comey's hand. Nothing, not a single word about any of that. They blew right over it. Again, picking and choosing facts to spin the narrative in favor of whoever was behind that ridiculous propaganda piece. Let's get to the next thing. There's a couple sentences here where it says, relying on FBI information and Mr. Steele's, prosecutors obtained court approval to eavesdrop on Mr. Page, who was no longer with the Trump campaign. Silly Sally Yates, the first warrant application, Silly Sally Yates signed the first warrant application. I think we already suspected that, but now I assume we can confirm that it was Silly Sally Yates that signed on to the very first warrant application. Other applications were signed on by Dana Buente, who somehow got promoted and is now like number 3 over there at the Justice Department, and of course Rodenstein. So this line, relying on FBI information and Mr. Steele, and then they leave it there. What FBI information? What FBI information? The only information they would have had up to this point, when they went for that first warrant, was the dossier stuff. At this point, they hadn't even learned about Papadopoulos and Mr. Downer. They weren't that far yet. Well, I mean, they knew about that, but the meeting hadn't happened yet. Certainly Brennan and the people behind that part of the plot knew about it. But as far as the FBI is concerned, it's just this line that they were relying on the FBI information. What information? Again, the only information would have been what they got from Steele, but they say relying on information and Mr. Steele. Well, no, the FBI information they had was the memos that would later become the dossier, and that did come from Mr. Steele, allegedly. As you know, I don't believe that Steele wrote a damn thing. I believe he was the launderer. He was simply the guy who gave the dossier credibility. I don't believe that he, in fact, he admits, and in fact, in the civil case, as we've covered here many times, they apparently haven't read the PDF files like I have from the Christopher Steele's case in the UK, and then the BuzzFeed case where he gave depositions, where he said he did not seek out the information. It came to him. He never spoke personally with any of the sources. He relied on collectors who went to intermediaries. So it went from source to intermediary to collector to Steele. And who were these collectors and intermediaries? And who were the sources? They have none of this information. Relying on FBI information. Relying on FBI information and Mr. Steele. They were one and the same. And it was hearsay. Four places removed hearsay. It wasn't coming from Steele. Steele was telling them that he couldn't. Steele basically says it's right there in his own deposition. Oh, I don't know if any of it's true. It was raw intelligence. I can't confirm or deny anything is true. This is what they went on. But they never tell you that in this New York Times story. They want the reader to believe that Steele has got this rock-solid information, well-sourced, verified, and everything else, and that there's other information that the FBI has. It's bullshit, New York Times, and I've just called you out on it. Now, The Last Refuge points out a couple things, so I'm going to cover The Last Refuge take on this. One thing he points out that, again, is one of the ones I just left on the table, is that on the super secretive meeting by Strzok and Page and this John individual and this other woman who went to London to meet with Alexander Downhatch Downer at the Australian Embassy, he's got in here their quote, their assignment, which has not been previously reported. Their assignment, which has not been previously reported. Yeah, right. As is pointed out here by The Last Refuge, it was in the text messages, which were released 6 months ago, and it was reported on by the New York Times itself, the Washington Post, BuzzFeed, and others. So, nice job there, Last Refuge, pointing that out. I did the same. Let's see. And here is the final assessment of The Last Refuge, and I think it kind of reiterates what I've said several times in the past couple weeks that we're actually looking at here. And they put it in this particular way. They say political operatives, contractors used deep state access to the FBI and NSA databases to get raw data for opposition research. And keep in mind, these players were working for the rotten Reverend Clinton. Then they needed justification. Then came the sketchy counter-intel operation. Then they needed justification. Then came the use of the sketchy dossier to get a FISA warrant. Then they needed cover. Then came the Russian conspiracy. Then they needed cover. Then came the special counsel. And this is exactly right. What The Last Refuge is saying is that throughout this whole thing, as we've been going through it now all this time, what we are now seeing is this clear pattern where we constantly see the justification and the so-called evidence for what they did always follows the actions they took previously, which were illegal. They took the illegal actions, and then they create the reason why they took the illegal actions later, after the fact. It's just like they start the criminal investigation or the Trump-Russia counter-intel operation on July 28th, but they don't actually go talk and even confirm any of the information until 2 days after they've already launched the operation. Without any probable cause, on nothing but hearsay evidence. You can't do that. Not if you're a serious law enforcement agency. This is the FBI. And they're running a counterintelligence operation? Why would you run a counterintelligence operation? If you suspect that the Russians are meddling in the election, that there may be Trump associates who are part of that, working, colluding with them or something like that, you would launch an investigation, a criminal investigation, a criminal inquiry, some sort of something like that. But a counter-intel operation? A counter-intel operation is what you do once you've discovered that there's something going on and you want to try to preempt it. You want to try to stop it. You want to try to counter it. They began with a counterintelligence operation without ever even having an existing investigation which proved that there was a crime, or what crime was going on, or what activity was taking place that needed to be countered. They're running a counter-intel operation without the prerequisite that you would generally need to run a counter-intel operation. And the counter-intel operation was not a counter-intel operation. It was essentially a operation. This Crossfire Hurricane was essentially a cover. It was a cover operation that was supposed to look like a Trump-Russia investigation, or Russia impact in the election investigation, but that was the cover for what was really happening, which was a get Trump and anyone else associated with him investigation. So this is obvious. It's obvious to many people. Eventually, the corporate media will catch up. They're not going to be able to bury the story. They can drag it out for another year. They can drag it out as long as they can. But ultimately, the truth is coming out, my friends. There's just too much evidence there. So then another thing, in late October, law enforcement officials had found no proof of involvement with Russian hacking. No conclusive or direct link between Trump and the Russian government. This is at the very bottom of the New York Times story. The very bottom of the story, like second to the last, third to the last paragraph, they put in these two sentences. In late October, law enforcement officials had found no proof of involvement with Russian hacking. No conclusive or direct link between Trump and the Russian government. They admit it right there. They got nothing. But they persisted, because at that point, that was the end of October. Then the next thing that happens is, just as they're about ready to drop, this was supposed to be when they were going to drop the October surprise, but they didn't have the evidence to back the October surprise, and instead they got their own October surprise when Comey was forced to come out and reopen the Clinton email investigation, which threw a wrench in everything. So once Trump wins, then they have to do a quick spin on their axis and say, uh-oh, he won. Now what are we going to do? Well, we have to remove him from office. And that's when it went from a stop Trump pre-election to a take Trump down post-election operation, run by the same people. Here's another one. Mr. Comey assured Mr. Trump that the FBI intended to protect him on this point. And they're talking about the fact that Comey goes to see Trump, and he tells him, hey, you know, we got this information, you know, the Russians may have some dirt on you, some, blackmail material. Then he tells him about the PP-Gate story and all that. And, of course, Trump says, oh, that's all a bunch of nonsense, and I want you to get to the bottom of that and find out. And then, of course, we got essentially Comey looking at Trump and going, well, don't worry. Be assured that the FBI intends to protect you, Mr. President, on this particular point. It sounds an awful lot like extortion. Like, don't worry, Mr. Trump. Oh, I've got this, and I'll keep it right here in my pocket. I won't let this get out. We'll keep it under my hat. Of course, I'd like to be the FBI director for the next 4 years, and 8 if you serve 2 new terms, or maybe I like this or that, or maybe I've been involved in these things and those things, but of course I've got this letter. You know, so it almost makes it sound like he's letting Trump know, because really he should never have said anything to Trump, or if he was going to say something to Trump, he should have told him the whole truth and nothing but the truth. He didn't do that. He gave him a half-truth, just enough to almost sound like it was an extortion tactic or a blackmail tactic or something. Now, the correct thing to say to the president at that time would have been, Mr. President, let me give it to you, and then you tell him all of it, including who paid for it. Who paid for it? Mr. Trump, your opposition, Mrs. Clinton, she paid a company called Fusion GPS, and they've been working with some former British spy, and they've dug up some dirt. We don't know if it's true. We don't think it's true, but about you having sex with some Russian prostitutes and this type of thing over in Moscow when you were there for the Miss USA pageant. And I just want you to know this stuff's out there. I want you to know that we are investigating it, and I can assure you that what we're going to do is we're going to investigate it. We're going to get to the bottom of it. We're going to make sure that we debunk this. You say it's not true. I believe you when you say it's not true. It sounds crazy, but we're going to go ahead and chase it down. We're going to debunk it. We're going to get to the bottom of it, and we're going to have it debunked and ready to go. We're not going to say anything, okay? We don't want this out there, but If in fact somebody gets this story, somebody in the media, it leaks to the media somehow, and they get the story, we will be prepared, having investigated and proven it to be false. We will come out and immediately debunk it. Don't let it worry you, Mr. President. Get on with your job. I just want you to know it's out there, but we're on it. That's what you tell the President of the United States. That's not what he did. Now, that is basically all my comments on the New York Times story. And again, I want to emphasize that the most important thing in that entire story, which I hear very, very few people talking about, it is the most important thing, is that we learned that Obama signed national security letters in order to launch surveillance on whoever, Trump, Page, Manafort, whoever. We don't know who. Probably everybody. But this is the most important thing because this directly implicates Obama. Directly implicates Obama. Up until now, we could look at the FBI, the CIA, the DOJ, all these other people, and Obama was able to be kind of out of it. This ties Obama directly. He cannot avoid it. There's only two people that signed the national security letter, the President and the Attorney General. That's Obama and Lynch. They are hung on this right here. No one else. Obama can say, well, I didn't know about the national security letters. I heard about it on MSNBC. No, I'm sorry. Only two people who can sign the national security letter. It's Obama, the President and the Attorney General. That's Obama and Lynch. And that is a major crime. And here's why. The national security letter was something that was created when they created the Patriot Act. And it was basically created to say, look, what happens if we're right in the middle of a big terrorist attack? We don't have time to go do an investigation, to get the background information, to go get a FISA warrant from the FISA court. We could have a September 11th event going down in real time, but we may have just enough information, but not enough to go to the FISA court, no time to get to a FISA court. We need to stop a terrorist act in progress. We need some measure by which the chief executive can take which can address the situation. It would be very, very rare. We may never ever have to use a national security letter, and we hope we don't. But just in case something like that ever happens again, we need to have something in place that we can address the issue immediately. And that's why they created the national security letter. They did not create it so that you could use it to spy on all your political opponents. And now we know why Ben Rhodes, Susan Rice, and Samantha Power were doing all those hundreds and hundreds of unmaskings, because Obama was signing a national security letter. They were going over and initiating the subpoena to start the surveillance, and then they would go over right away and do the unmasking to get the data from the national security letter surveillance that they had just initiated. That's exactly what was going on. It's pretty obvious. It's very criminal. It's very illegal. And Obama cannot wiggle off that hook. He and Lynch are toast. And that is the most important thing in this entire story. And I do hope that in the next week or two, mainstream media and these analysts pick up on that fact. They need to read the story again. This is brand new information that we never knew. And this is criminal. And it ties Obama personally. He cannot wiggle off the hook. This implicates him personally in this entire thing. He knew about everything else, but he could always deny that. He can't deny this. He can't get out of this. He is locked in on this. Let's talk about something else, about these FBI informants. Or in this case, this wasn't an informant, this wasn't a mole, this wasn't anything like that, or even a spy. This is the terms that are being used to describe this person who we believe is Stefan Halper. We don't know at this point, but it's now been almost a solid week. It's been out there. No one has denied it. No one has come out and denied it. Mr. Halper's spokesman has not come out and denied it. We haven't heard a peep. The FBI, the DOJ, no one has come out to deny Mr. Halper was the so-called informant. But I think the proper word in this case is not informant or spy or anything like that. The proper word here is agent provocateur. Agent provocateur. His position in this particular case and what he was doing was to set traps for people. That is an agent provocateur, not a mole, not a spy, not an informant. An agent provocateur who has a much more nefarious mission in most cases. So, let's understand that right away. Let's also understand something else about how informants do work. Because technically, he's an informant, or agent provocateur, whatever. But here's how this works. When the police decide to put an informant inside to an investigation, the very first thing they have to do is assign him a number in the case file that they're working. They must assign him a number to identify him as an informant. Informant number blah, 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 blah. 115692235. Informant number. They must put it in the case file. They must state exactly how he's being paid, who is paying him, how much he's being paid, and how he's being compensated, and where that money is coming from. From another investigation, funds allocated to this investigation, funds from somewhere else, or what have you. They have to show how and where he's being paid on the investigation. They must also take daily or at least regular notes. They must have regular contact with the informant. They must debrief him on a fairly regular basis and take interviews with him and take notes of what he is learning as he is undercover as an informant on the investigation. They must keep a file on all of this. And there's other things involved too that I don't have time to go into. But you have to record your informant. The day he started on the investigation, his informant number, a lot of other things. And the reason is because when you go into court to prosecute the case that he was working on, you have to be able to show the judge that he was an active informant the day he was activated, his official number, informant number. You have to show the judge all the meetings that took place as he was acting as an informant, collaborating with, communicating with his people back at the home office, telling them what he was learning as they moved the investigation forward. You've got to document and record all this for the court. You can't just be sitting there in court one day and the investigation also says, hey, we got this special witness. Here he comes. Bring him in. And then in he comes, the informant. Hi, I'm the informant. Guess what? Nobody knew about me, but I've been in there the whole time. I've been undercover the whole time, and let me tell you what I've learned. No, it doesn't work like that. Everything has to be documented, and it all has to be done through this process. Otherwise, it is not admissible in court, which means if this was an official legal investigation and there was an informant by the FBI placed into this campaign, then Mr. Nunes and Mr. Grassley, and I'm sure Mr. Huber and all the rest, they know this. Mr. Huber would know it. Rodenstein would know this. Sessions would know this. These guys have worked a lot of these cases with undercover informants. They know that there better be somewhere at the DOJ or FBI a file with this so-called informant, stating exactly when he was hired, what his informant number is. They must have communications with him noted throughout his activity, and anything that he uncovers in his investigation that does not find its way into the file. He can't just come into court after the fact and say all this stuff. It has to be documented in the file. That's why you have to have regular contact with your informant. If all that is not present, then they violated the law. He's not an official informant, and nothing he says can be used in a criminal proceeding. It gets thrown out. So they need to get in there and find out if he was an actual legal informant and where he came from and who was paying him. That's how things work. And now you know. Here's a good question for you. Did the CIA set up or frame the FBI? Did the CIA frame the FBI or set them up? Or even worse, did someone at the State Department set up or frame the CIA? Is it possible that we're going to learn when we get to the end of this that we had the CIA playing around with the FBI, using them? Because essentially it was Brennan who gave this intelligence to the FBI and said, hey, you better get on this, when he knew it was all bogus. He essentially set up the FBI. Essentially, he framed them. It's just funny to look at it that way. I mean, if you want to look at it that way, you certainly could. You certainly could. Now, I've been doing some digging because, as you know, I'm trying to find the very root origins of Papagalopoulos. Trying to find the root origins of Papagalopoulos. I know who brought him in. We now know where he got his credentials and who helped move him along. But I'm trying to get to the actual root. Who he is connected to at the root. Still not quite there because I'm working with public source information, open source. I don't have access to government databases. But I did discover some things that are shining some more light on the subject. I did learn that Mr. Halper, Stefan Halper, did work for the State Department and is a close friend of Madeleine Halfbright. He is also a very close friend of Robert Dearlove, former head of MI6, who we know had contacts with Brennan 2 times, at least, that we know of. We know that essentially Mr. Misford went dark somewhere around November, the end of November of 2017, when his name came out as a possible source or alleged source of the for Papagalopoulos, which that the Russians hacked the DNC and had the emails and all that. It's Mr. Misford was outed as the source of that back in November 2017. But we know that Mr. Halper has also gone pretty much dark. No one's heard a peep out of him, and no one has denied, either he or anyone on his behalf, that he was the source. But we know something else from the previous video when I told you that Halper had invited Carter Page 4 days after his Moscow trip to come to Cambridge to listen to some speeches. We now know that one of the person in attendance that day, one of the speech givers on that day, was Madeleine Halfbright. Oh yeah. And who is Madeleine Halfbright? Former Secretary of State under Slick Willie, and a very, very close friend of the Rotten Reverend Clinton. We understand that they have lunch and drinks on a regular basis. Madeleine Halfbright was a speaker at that Cambridge event that Halper invited Carter Page to. That's very interesting, don't you think? Trump tweeted out this morning that an informant was in place early on in the campaign. That's what is being alleged by Andrew McCarthy. And so Trump tweeted that out. In his testimony to Congress, Glenn Simpson of Confusion GPS told of the FBI source. Simpson said in his testimony to Congress that Christopher Steele met with the FBI in 2016, September of 2016, and in that meeting, the FBI told Steele that they had a human source inside the Trump campaign. They also said the person, so-called informant, came forward to investigators independently. The FBI says that they put the informant in after the Russian investigation started July 28th of 2016. But as we know from the timeline I went through a couple of days ago, that Stefan Halper, who was involved with his contacts back in the spring of 2016. It's exactly what Kimberly Strassel said in her first article that she did, when she said, yeah, we all want to know the name of this individual, which we now think is Stefan Halper. That's important. We need to get the name. We should get the name, and we will get the name confirmed. But what's more important, as she said, and she is right, is when was this so-called informant, who's really an agent provocateur, when was he actually put in? Well, as we know from the timeline that I went through 2 days ago, we know that Mr. Halper was having contacts with Papagalopoulos, with Carter Page, with other people. We suspect other people. Certainly Mr. Misford certainly would have had to have contact with Mr. Misford, who's the person who whispered in Papagalopoulos' ear about the hacked emails, allegedly. So we know that this informant was active before July of 2016. He was working as early as the spring, May, June, July. In those 3 months, Mr. Halper, if he is the informant, Mr. Halper was communicating with all these players long before the official investigation opened July 28th. The official investigation, we're told, was opened July 28th. And they're telling us that based on that, we put an informant in there. But if you look at the timeline, it appears that the Mr. Halper, if he was the informant, was placed into this investigation or was involved several months before July the 28th of 2016. He was busy contacting people, making contacts in early as April, May, June, July. So 3-4 months before the investigation was officially started, that so-called informant was already in play. And when that comes out, that blows up that theory. Just about everything they tell us, we prove to be a lie. And we don't even have all the information. This is child's play. We also learn from the Senate report that came out the other day that mostly focused on the Trump Tower meeting, where the lunatic Democrats in that nutcase Mr. Burr, who I believe is from North Carolina, who's anti-Trump as hell, they put out their own sort of report on the Trump Tower, whatever. And they try to make it sound like there was something really going on there. But what we learned, I think that was most important, what I learned from looking into a little bit of that, was that the most important thing I got out of that Senate report about the Trump Tower meeting is what we learned about Mr. Rinat Akhmetshin. Mr. Rinat Akhmetshin, who's former Soviet or former Russian military intelligence, who was at that meeting. He attended that meeting at the Trump Tower. This was the setup meeting with Don Jr., Manafort, Kushner, Veselnitskaya, Mr. Akhmetshin, and 2 other people who were there. Rob Goldstone was there, the man who set the meeting up. Anyway, all those people were there. But we now know that Mr. Akhmetshin, Rinat Akhmetshin, knows Hillary Clinton. This is what he said in his testimony to the Senate committee. He admitted to knowing Hillary Clinton. He also says that he had contacts with Clinton's inner circle. He would not specify on when. He also said that he had that his attorney, Edward Lieberman, knows Hillary Clinton well, and that he is not a fan of Trump or the Trump family. So clearly he wasn't there to help Trump. He's a friend of Hillary's. Why would he take part in a meeting to give Trump, who he doesn't like, dirt on Hillary, who he likes and knows? He knows her inner circle, and his lawyer is a very good friend of the Clintons. The Clintons know every Jewish lawyer in D.C. It appears they would not elaborate about the specifics of contacts with Clinton or her campaign. So Mr. Akhmetshin admits these things, but when they ask him about when he may have had contacts or whatever, he would not comment on the dates where he had contact with people in the Clinton campaign or anything else. He said he'd met Clinton originally on social occasions. Very interesting, because as I say, the deeper you dig into this rabbit hole, when you get to the bottom of it, you're going to find the rotten Reverend Clinton. Former DNI Clapper, the unwitting idiot, told CNN just Thursday night that it was a good thing that the FBI had someone spying on the Trump campaign. Also said the FBI may have had someone that was talking to them, I assume he means the FBI, in the campaign. You think that's good, Mr. Clapper? You think that's good that in the political campaign, the one political administration has a FBI plant inside the campaign of the other administration? You think that's good, Mr. Clapper? Based on no evidence of any crime? No probable cause? No reasonable suspicion? Nothing? Just planting FBI mole, agent provocateur into the campaign? That's all good with you, Mr. Clapper? Grassley wants to see that scope memo. By the way, that Judge Ellis who told Mueller, I want the scope memo and I want it unredacted, Mueller turned it over 2 days ago. Judge Ellis now has the scope memo, and now Grassley wants it Nunez wants it. Everybody wants the scope memo. Why don't you send me a copy? I'd like to have a look. How about all of you? Would you like to see the scope memo? Well, that's all we have time to get through to today. We do have a couple more items which I'll have to get to tomorrow. Or I can just do a real quick second video right now. Let's do that. I'll be back in 5 minutes.